So welcome back to the live event and welcome to our virtual viewers as well. We've heard quite a bit this morning about trust and security and identity, so it's high time that we dived into that topic a bit more closely. So we're going to do that with a fireside chat now, and the topic is securing customers' trust in conversations. And we have Simeon Coney here, who's the CSO of AdaptiveMobile Security. He's going to be having a chat with James Lasbury, who's the VP of Carrier Relations at Vonage. So over to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. So yes, this afternoon we would like to start talking about securing customers' trust in conversations. So yes, as Tim said, I'm Simeon Coney, and I work for a company called AdaptiveMobile Security. What we do is, essentially, we secure networks. So protecting about a quarter of the world today, we help keep people safe online. But I'm joined today by James from Vonage. If I could ask you to introduce yourself and maybe give a quick introduction to who Vonage is.
So my name's James Lasbury. I'm VP of Carrier Relations. Vonage acquired Nexmo a long time ago now, it feels. But basically that was their API side of the business. We've got Contact Center and UC. And effectively, we've just had an offer from Ericsson, which has been accepted by our shareholders. And the transaction should hopefully complete by the start of next year.
Exciting times ahead. So, in talking about securing customers' trust, I guess really the first thing we ought to do is really say, well, who is the customer? And quite often when we use that word, we're thinking about an individual, us sitting there holding the phone. But I think the reality is there's probably three different parties who would consider themselves the customer. I mean, firstly, we've got the end user, but then we've actually got the brand and enterprise, the people who are spending the money. I think even arguably we've got the terminating carrier. They are a major part in that transaction. They consider themselves as a customer of the service here. And in fact, even so far as there are two other additional parties in this whole chain. One is the CPaaS, the aggregator, who is onboarding the enterprise. And lastly, one party that's increasingly becoming more visible across the globe is regulators and industry bodies. They're now starting to have quite a voice, particularly when it comes to securing customers, securing the conversation there. So James, starting with this, I'd love to hear the insights that you've got really in, let's say, the first step of that chain. What sort of requirements are you hearing from customers, from brands?
Yeah, so from our platform perspective, clearly we work with Adaptive to secure a lot of our services, so securing our platform so that when developers sign on and start using APIs, basically we're making sure that there's not fraudulent activity at that point, and then they're tightly monitored to obviously protect both our customers and the brands. Two of the biggest issues which I think everyone is seeing in the market today is the basically fake traffic, so fake traffic generated by fraudsters in a sense. So either taking control of an enterprise's platform or actually defrauding a consumer's platform. And that, for me, has the impact of basically the trust goes in the whole ecosystem as soon as that happens. So having a partner like Adaptive who can secure the end-to-end service, which they do on behalf of us in real time, which allows us to monitor and analyze all of our customers and our customers' platforms, is really important.
Thanks, James. Let me give you a for instance of what that actually looks like. So often when we talk about, good traffic and bad traffic, we've got this view out there that there are these, black hat, shadowy figures that exist, and then we've got everyone else who's good. One real example that I can share with you is that one of our customers had a very large community of religious organizations. They used Omnichannel as a way to reach out to their parishioners, to their subscribers, and keep in regular contact, sharing details like sales, community events, services, prayer for the day. They also happen to be the biggest source of American Express phishing. The two things just don't reconcile. Turns out it was a classic example of exactly what you described there, James. hijack an account takeover. Somebody somewhere, maybe on a church parish board, probably had the little post-it notes with the username and the account number to say, this is how we send messages. Somebody realized that and thought, I can use this. So in terms of understanding what makes somebody good, what makes somebody bad, it's not clear-cut. Being able to actually help, and in fact, in this instance, identify the account and help them cleanse that behavior, find the source, regain that control over it. But particularly as we'll explore, that type of behavior, if you don't really understand exactly what's going on, can very significantly erode the trust.
Absolutely. And if you look at kind of what it means beyond kind of just that use case, the education that's gone on in the industry over the past kind of 10 years, now I speak to my parents, they're aware that they actually have to protect their identity. They can't hand over the security details. They're becoming much more aware online. But it feels like, actually, who's there for the brands? So our customers who come to us for basically guidance, and we secure our platform, but who there is monitoring their platform and making sure someone's not obviously artificially running traffic over it, breaking into their applications or their websites that they've taken time to build. There's a huge part of the ecosystem that's missing. And I think it's great being at a MEF event because MEF has taken obviously a position from a sender ID registration perspective, which allows CPaaS players to help regulate the enterprise business and help protect and control them. But it needs more participation and education. If I think now I can speak to my parents and they understand kind of what fraud is. Often when we speak to brands, they understand what it is, but they don't necessarily see it as part of their responsibility, and we have to work with them, I think, more.
And I think, particularly, we're here at an Omnichannel event, and we heard earlier this morning from a professional services organization. Essentially, we're talking about integrating more of our customers, the brand's business, into that communication channel. And I think these types of risks are going to come more to the forefront. Every point of integration is a potential point of abuse or misuse. Any weaknesses on those systems that were previously internal potentially could become a weakness that is exposed to the world. So I think the obligation, the conversation definitely needs to evolve and enhance for people to understand exactly what it takes now to facilitate this. It's not just a question of connecting something up and starting to do something. It's thinking through the implications of all of this.
Obviously, MEF focused on, in a big way, was how we kind of educate and work with the operators. I know that's an area that you spend a lot of time, Simeon. Do you want to explain kind of what you do for the operators as well as obviously the CPaaS players?
Yeah, absolutely. So effectively, from our perspective, we secure both ends of the conversation. We're there at the point of origination when somebody is requesting something, and we're also deployed in the terminating networks, securing all of the inbound traffic. And that's not just all the A2P traffic, because, again, look at it from the lens of the customer perspective. They're here holding their phone. If they receive something that is purporting to be from a brand, they don't know which route it came in from. They don't know that that was an A2P generated message versus a SIM-bank message versus a fraudster message. Trying to educate people what becomes a legitimate message is incredibly hard, particularly when we're talking the whole world here again. There isn't a sufficient education channel to have that discussion, to have that conversation. So from the terminating carrier's perspective, they're looking at it saying, how can I put in place controls to enable and support this? Because carriers are benefiting hugely from this type of conversation. We all saw Nick's stats earlier of the potential here. But at the same time, let's not pollute and let's not corrupt that channel, because if we lose that customer's trust, they will not respond.
And it's funny being on the operator side as well. Previously I was speaking to Glyn, and it's funny how little changes in the time. But from an operator perspective, you think that you've controlled everything, but you have very little visibility over the actual value chain. And actually, with MEF and other associations, but in particular the work that MEF has done in terms of bringing that ecosystem together, I do believe there's more that can be done around brands, because I very rarely see brands talking at these events. I think Virgin was a case study that was mentioned for about 10 years at the event. We need to move on and have brands talking at these events with the operators to help educate. Because you think by working with a firewall company, you're basically stopping all of the issues. But in reality, you're very unaware of kind of what's going on at the consumer level, how you protect businesses and the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. And in fact, I mean, I mentioned earlier that one of the parties that perceive themselves involved in this discussion is industry bodies. And I don't actually mean the telecoms, the MEFs and the GSMAs of this world. I actually mean the financial verticals, the healthcare verticals. And I think having their participation in these discussions is going to be absolutely key, because now increasingly what we're finding, I mean, carriers certainly have a luxury where they operate in one country or in a defined set of countries. So they've got some fairly clear set of guidelines and boundaries of those local domestic regulations. But we are starting to see a number of industry groups define expressly what they consider to be appropriate engagements. We've seen financial services, for example, rule on how people use one-time passwords and 2FAs. We're starting to see country regulators rule on things like hours of contact for appropriate type of content. We're starting to see regulation on what type of category of content. So, I mean, the US has this unusual behavior where, for example, recreational drugs are legal in some states, but not at a federal level. Well, what about communication that spans state boundaries? Is that legal? Is that illegal? These are all areas that haven't been expressly regulated. But as an industry, I think we've got an opportunity right now to facilitate, to be that forum, to have those discussions. Because otherwise they're only going to occur in stovepipe. And the worst effect, the worst outcome is that regulation comes and it's imposed. It's not a discussion, it's not a comprehension.
Yeah, that's the biggest fear of everyone in the ecosystem. When you get to that point where the regulator has to come in, it's almost gone too far. And thankfully there's kind of few examples of where that's happened. But in terms of kind of our role next, what we're trying to do here, if it's not apparent, we're trying to run a kind of conversation. So just to say what's happening here. And we're trying to basically say the market is now shifting from notifications and verifications predominantly to conversational commerce. And you would have seen last month, so the middle of last month, Vonage announced the acquisition of Jumper AI, and that really is to push forward that part and give us a capability in that space, because that's the future of kind of messaging and CPaaS as we see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, I mean, touching on conversations, I mean, looking at the title of what we're talking about here for our conversation, I mean, we're talking about securing customers' trust. And I think quite often one of the risks is that people often see the word security and trust and assume them to be the same thing in a conversational context. And they're not. They're actually quite different. I mean, security is, and I'm going to have to read off my notes here, the state of being protected or safe for harm. So, I mean, in reality, what that really means is it's about what permissions a party is granted. Whereas trust is, and again, forgive me for reading this verbatim, but it's the trust of one party to another for an identified service with the measurable belief that the other behaves in an understandable, predictable manner. Now that sounds like it's caveated in all sorts of language, but what they really mean is trust is about checking to see if they're behaving in a way that you expect them for that service. So security is about setting up the rules, but trust is actually saying, are they actually conforming in that way? The only way you can tell that is by being involved in the conversation. A push notification doesn't really have a measurable element of trust because you can't tell what the recipient actually thought of that. But when you start to engage in a conversation and you see how the recipient is engaging, you can now start to determine and measure the effect of that.
And it's quite funny because looking at the Jumper AI kind of use cases, a lot of people talk about the kind of conversation and the way it's happening. But looking into some of the companies that have worked with Ben & Jerry's around, basically Ben & Jerry's launching new ice cream flavors, which I think is a great idea, but doing it in a way where they communicate with basically their consumers. And they offered a pint of free ice cream if you basically said, right, this is my favorite flavor of the flavors that you're about to launch. And then what they did, which was really smart, is say, look, this is where you can redeem it at the local Ben & Jerry kind of vending machine, which meant they had a complete cycle going with the customer rather than just a notification. They really engaged them. They found a reason for kind of communicating. And then they actually fulfilled it at the end with, obviously, where the Ben & Jerry's vending machine was. So it's smart kind of communications like this is what we're increasingly going to see.
Yeah, and I think those are exactly the type of case studies we would like to see, because what you're now starting to see is a clear action and an outcome that is of direct benefit to their business. And we're not measuring just a little part of it. We're actually trying to put that conversation in context of the business. And it all helps us to think with the right perspective of what these people are trying to achieve, and then maybe come up with the solutions for that type of market there.
And do you, Simeon, find that you still have to educate people about the difference between security and trust? Or do you think it's becoming clear?
Oh, no, most definitely. I mean, some of the big challenges is, for example, I mean, when people talk security, they think it's a checkbox. It's like, okay, I'm secure, I bought something, I've deployed it, that's it, we're done, now let's move on. You know, security is an ethos. You know, it is, I'm sorry, it's a journey for life. You've just got to keep doing it because, you know, and frankly, the other perspective I think that's quite often lost is security for one person means that you're often preventing another person from doing something. You know, you're securing against a particular behavior. That behavior is being done because somebody's making money out of it. So they are motivated to try and get around those controls, to try and find a way to exploit to their advantage. There is a deliberate reason that they were trying to do that in the first place. You have to therefore be mindful of that and thinking about what have they done to change in a result of what you've put in place. So security is a journey, not just a particular checkpoint. But trust is coming back more to what does it mean to my business? Does the stock market trust my business? Do consumers trust my brand? If I send a communication to a user, will they respond because they actually trust who I am and they understand who I am?
And it's interesting that move in terms of when you talk about trust. We've all operated in this kind of wonderful ecosystem for some time that's growing kind of 30 to 40% year on year. And we've kind of taken it for granted, but what innovation is going to kind of drive it on, and it is trust. It is kind of creating really a world in which consumers are protected, operators feel they can enable the service without being taken advantage of, really a kind of ecosystem that everyone gets fair value within. So.
And I think, you know, from an ecosystem perspective, one of the things that we really want to see, and by we, I'm broadly using the whole security community here, is for the ecosystem to come together to try and find effective ways of helping that trust from the end user. Because I think so often when we see case studies, everyone is always thinking the good flow, the legitimate cases, the perfect scenario where somebody does something, you know, they respond, they choose their ice cream, they pick up the product. What's not being considered is, okay, the people are going to exploit all of the other channels. You know, at the end of the day, everything ends up in your messaging inbox. So anyone can do anything to disrupt or impersonate or obfuscate that particular experience. And this is where I think we have the risks of trust through association. You know, if we've sent one good message, but a user has got 9 bad ones, what do you think their perspective is going to be of that one good message? It's going to be poor. And again, I think as an ecosystem, we need to be mindful, seeing things through the lens of the customer. So yes, we talk about having the brands here. I think we need more perspective of what the users are actually facing in their daily lives. How do we educate them? How do we keep them safe?
And it's something clearly we use adaptive services, like I said at the start. It's critical for us to understand the trends because we only really know there's fraud happening when we see something irregular happening on our platform, which means we're one step behind already. In reality, if we're securing each part of the value chain, so a customer has a secure platform from the start, it's kind of how do we start that conversation around trust with the enterprises? And as CPaaS vendors and probably people that are kind of integrators and closer to the brands, it's probably how we start that conversation now, Simeon, with those brands and enterprises and help to educate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll give you another example of, for instance, here. grey routes. I mean, we all understand why grey routes exist. You know, sometimes it's the only way to get traffic through to an end location. The effect, though, that has on end users. I mean, who's pulled out their phone and received a one-time password, but actually not known who it's really from? It's from a long number. Or where sometimes you've got a password from 5 different services, all from the same number. You're then starting to question, well, who's really behind this? Or sometimes, even worst of all, there's actually no message other than just a 5-digit number. You know, yes, we understand why that's being done, but from an end user's perspective, they've actually started to lose the one thing that we've spoken about earlier today, which is identity. They've lost that association. How do you get trust if you've not got a clear comprehension of the brand? So a lot of the actions have unintended consequences that can effectively have a longer term impact, particularly as we want to try and evolve some of these services.
Yeah, and it's just working out the role. We're part of the Google SMS verification, which is a great service whereby they protect basically all Android users and make sure that they look at the message before it's sent out, and then regulate and make sure it's basically sent by the business identity or the logo thereafter. And it's kind of working out examples like this whereby we can make it easier for businesses and consumers to understand where they can kind of safely use services and where there are examples of fraud.
Yeah, and I think Omnichannel is a great example where there are inconsistencies in that. I mean, we're now starting to see signed email, certified email. We've got things like the verified SMS, but voice, no such thing exists in the voice environment. So when we're talking an omnichannel engagement, how do we give users that feeling of comfort, surety across no matter what the service is, that it is actually the legitimate party reaching them across all those different channels, particularly when they may be using different identities.
And this is where some of the new use cases should be coming through, in that clearly the upside of obviously COVID that we've seen is that a lot of the technology is being used by the healthcare system, the schooling system, education, etc. So they are pushing basically the boundaries of how they use video in combination with messaging and integrated voice, which has enabled kind of everything to continue in the horrific kind of last 2 to 3 years that we've had. But securing all of that, Simeon, isn't like just like you were talking about the grey routes, etc. It's the end-to-end experience.
Yeah, end-to-end and across different vertical technology stacks. I mean, I think we all understand how complex that technology is. End users don't. They see a device, they have one experience. So again, I think there's an opportunity for us to try and find ways to find some level of commonality, to start thinking about solutions that presents a little bit more consistency from an end user's perspective.
And what's your view in terms of like the next evolution? We're seeing obviously a lot of change in the markets. Do you see kind of the market evolving around these services?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly wearing a security hat, I mean, what we always find is that service innovation happens and then security is an afterthought. So yes, I mean, there's most definitely a risk where new services will come to market, people will find a way of exploiting them, and then belatedly people will try and close and patch the holes to give a better user experience. I do see, though, the sort of the innovation and the creativity in other services. You know, we've been talking about all the other different communication methods that are all vying for customer attention as well. You know, the challenges there of how do we actually give customers a sort of an experience that enables them to transition from one service, from one bearer to another. I mean, yes, it's great that you can send a message and reply back saying, call me back, but why doesn't it just get a little bit easier of hitting a call button and you swap to a voice call? I mean, the other thing is even internally in businesses, why can't we have an easier handoff experience? So if you're talking to customer care and then they want to pass you through to sales or ordering, you know, I mean, God, it'd be great to have an end to music on hold. Personal bugbear of mine. But yeah, I mean, I think going back to your question there, James, in terms of evolution, there is a lot of creativity. I think we're almost at the hiatus at the moment of service innovation. I think we're going to start seeing a whole new wave, particularly as we sort of move out of the current environment and people are actually able to get together and start, you know, implementing all the ideas that they've had for the last 2 years. But I think certainly the future of people looking at conversations and starting to make more about actually what is the conversation, not just what am I doing to carry my little part of it, is an exciting future. And maybe if I can turn it around, I mean, what are you seeing in terms of evolution, doing both the originating and the terminating side of things?
Yeah, so I can see Tim's going to come on with questions very soon. But
These online questions as you just finish up.
Yeah.
so kind of the conversation now isn't an if, it's a when. So APIs are already being combined. So the fact no one discusses an SMS API, they discuss a messaging API. It's all combined. They also think video is going to be part of that and voice is going to be part of that. That isn't up for debate now. If the platforms don't have these capabilities, really they're not future-proofed. And it's about probably the next wave that we can't foresee. What is full 5G communication kind of going to bring in terms of user experience? They're probably the use cases that we haven't even predicted yet.
Yeah, it's exciting times. I mean, I think that exactly the bandwidth is there, the horsepower on the device is there. I mean, those were always a thing that sort of catalyzed almost sort of the 3G and notionally the 4G transformation. I think 5G itself is going to force a lot of businesses to start thinking creativity. What can you do with huge number of connected devices? What can you do with very low latency? What can you do with pervasiveness of contact?
And getting back to probably the points on this, nothing is going to change unless we've got the consumer, the brand's trust, and the operator's trust. Those kind of, the evolution will just take a lot longer unless we actually get together as a probably an ecosystem to protect consumers and brands.
Most definitely. I mean, that would be the closing statement, certainly from my side, is we need that joined up community coming together to have those conversations. Because if we don't, it is going to be enforced on us.
Okay, good. Right, you're going to keep looking out at the audience, so you don't have to crane your neck and look at me. And I will just ask a couple of quick questions. First of all, I'll ask if there's anyone in the audience who wants to raise their hand and ask a question. We do have one at the back. Superb. While we're waiting for that, actually, somebody's just asked online if there are any sort of banking use cases that you can reference. I think it's probably the premier vertical when it comes to messaging security. So maybe you can just quickly answer that one while we're waiting for the...
Yeah, I mean, well, so banking as a sector absolutely has been the most targeted as well as by security, as well as is the greatest adopter of security. I mean, you know, they really led, I think, a lot of the adoption on one-time passwords, 2FA, the use of mobile banking apps. But by the same token, by using those, they've somewhat opened up, in some instances, themselves to exploit. So if people are able to intercept those tokens, they're now able to prove themselves. And I think another great example of where we are no longer an industry. I think we are an industry that integrates with many industries. So the fact that banks use us to secure that transaction means those two things are inextricably linked. You can't separate the two. So again, we've got a responsibility maybe to have that joined up conversation.
Yeah, but banks kind of lead the way. They're kind of way ahead of the like utilities, education, almost like public businesses. They're the ones that led the kind of revolution with regards to messaging scale. They're the ones that led the kind of video conversations where you could secure your mortgage by having a video conversation with your bank like 5 years ago. So they're pushing the boundaries. They're probably two use cases. I'm a little bit worried what David's going to ask here.
We've seen in years gone by that SMS has data security challenges. We've seen that through, for example, the theft of customer banking PINs in Germany as an example. Question for you, James. Do you see demand from brands for end-to-end encryption on SMS and some of these new channels coming out? And then Simeon, to you, do you see a way that end-to-end encryption on these business communications channels can coexist with the ability that you guys do to root out bad traffic?
So ultimately, yes, David. I mean, unless we have the end-to-end encryption and we're talking about trust and security, unless the method to communicate is secure, it's not going to work. And that's what ultimately brands want to buy. They need to know it'll work and they need to know their customers are protected, so yes.
Yeah. I'm going to offer a contrary view in that absolutely it needs to be secure end to end. The challenge though is that then puts huge responsibility to make sure that every other bit of communication is legitimate. Because if no longer can anyone deliver some form of security whilst it's in transit, anyone again can go back to doing anything. And in fact, I mean, we've seen this with, for example, notably WhatsApp. You know, that is secure end-to-end. For a while, when anybody could contact anyone else, people were receiving all sorts of messages. So yes, end-to-end is needed for that security of, I at least trust who that originator is, but you are now surrendering the ability to deliver any form of security on anyone else contacting you. And frankly, I don't know what the answer is. It's a double-edged sword.
Okay, all right. Well, look, thank you so much for that entertaining discussion, Simeon and James. Please show your appreciation. Thank you.